Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca, and I am a PhD candidate in Virginia Tech's Alliance for Social, Political, Ethical, and Cultural Thought program. I've worked as a graduate research assistant at the Center for Humanities, which is why I love public humanities, which is why I am starting this podcast. And I'm also an instructor, graduate teaching assistant in the Virginia Tech Department of Religion and Culture. So that's why I am where I am at currently in a break. I'm heading into my final semester, and it's time to start sharing where the research is at with my friends and inviting different friends onto the podcast to have conversations about essentially what the research is about and to get feedback. Um, I'm here in beautiful South Carolina, and I will be traveling all over the Midwest and the South, visiting different Anabaptist communities. And you will see different things come about, hopefully, different backdrops that will make this podcast all the more interesting. I am starting this podcast because the subject of my research has to do with Anabaptist and anarcho pacifist political theology. I start with Anabaptist political theology, but really I'm situating it within the context of the medieval world and the different movements that have influenced that early development of this form of political theology. And as I will talk about in future episodes, there is a huge overlap between people who essentially are anarcho pacifist, or some people call them Christian anarchist, authors, such as in 19th century America, William Lloyd Garrison, Adin Ballou, different abolitionist theologians. And then you have Leo Tolstoy, Jacques Ellul, different people who actually have been cited by and discussed by Anabaptist political theologians that came after them. So there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of overlap. I think, well, we'll get into the whole kind of theoretical way or theological framework that I'm using, but essentially I'm focusing on ascetic. I'm interpreting Anabaptist and anarcho-pacifist theology as sort of an ascetic slash monastic movement in its own right. And I am using sort of this approach to the theology to look at essentially research gaps where the theology has not explored questions of gender based violence and sexual violence. So, with regards to sort of the contemporary problem that drives my research, there'll be more of that in future episodes, but in simple form, I'm looking at political theology and how it affects people who have survived um, gender based and sexual violence, particularly in the form of secondary traumatization. So these are all like the big defining terms, but in short, secondary traumatization is what happens when someone who experienced an act of, say, gender based and sexual violence, that's what my project is looking at, then goes to a community in which they are a part of, largely a religious community, and says, they begin to disclose, or they, even if they haven't disclosed, they might hear conversations about the subject that might influence whether or not they disclose and how they feel about themselves in the recovery process, in the process of healing or not healing. Things like spiritual bypassing, where you're kind of told, well, you should just rejoice or be glad or be thankful, or, God has done it all. So why are you suffering? You shouldn't be suffering. Something's wrong with you if you're suffering. So that's spiritual bypassing. And all of this is very carefully defined in the research. But secondary traumatization can also take the form of being told, you just need to forgive and forget, being told that you shouldn't report something, being told that you should stay in a situation and suffer on behalf of the person who is doing you harm, to be Christ-like to them. And all of this, I believe, relates in certain, I'm addressing the part of all of this secondary traumatization that specifically relates to asceticism, monasticism, and all of that in Anabaptist and anarcho-pacifist political theology. Um, how I'm going about the research is it's mainly a literature study. I will look at literature and secondary victimization, on sexual and gender based violence, and then I will look at the entire structure of Anabaptist and anarcho pacifist political theology as it has developed over time. Uh, Surprisingly, not very much has changed since like the 13th century. Um, so I'll be looking at very, very early writings and movements from which these kinds of thinking emerged, um, and then tracing and then looking at specifically how the theological, political theology, the whole system, the whole framework has not really addressed gender based violence at all. Or very, like the way that the theology of non-violence, of peacemaking, non-retaliation, non-resistance set up, it doesn't really consider gender-based violence or how gender shapes violence. um, I say it's often written for a male protagonist. So, for example, if you have the 16th century Anabaptists and they're like, we will not carry the sword, we will not participate in violent rule that employs the sword, we will not go to war. All these things mainly are things that women did not do during that time. But what the theology is not addressing is what happens if you're saying we're not going to resist, we're not going to report, we're going to forgive and love our enemies. But what happens if it's vulnerable to different forms of violence? That is a very strong wind coming through. Just hit pause for a second. The main context in which the research is taking place would be the different Anabaptist communities in which I have spent a lot of time over the past 4 academic years that I've been working on this dissertation. I've gotten to, be on podcasts, be part of a community of practice addressing these questions, discerning these questions. And the purpose of the podcast is to be able to have conversations about these questions. I always say in Anabaptism that it's not I, but we. Most of the things that I've talked about in other podcasts or even, advocacy, things like that, I've not really just developed these questions on my own. It's come about from conversations with different survivors, people who have lived with the theologies, who grew up with the martyr stories, singing the hymns about the martyrs, having maybe the martyr's mirror be the only book in their home besides the Bible, though that's probably the minority of cases where stories of like visceral suffer like Christ, be crucified like Christ takes on very literal, visceral, and a traumatic form with huge emotional and mental health impacts. So we'll be talking about those things on this podcast, engaging with these questions from a variety of perspectives, which is why I'm starting this podcast on its own, so that I can talk to a lot of different people from different perspectives and include that here as part of a community of practice, um, discerning these questions. Stuart Murray Williams's doctoral dissertation in 1994 talked about Anabaptist hermeneutics as being something that is produced in community, by community, in conversation. It's not something created from the top down, and something that I have really desired to do in my research, especially because I'm not doing empirical research. I'm not doing, say, an oral history of survivor stories and how Anabaptist beliefs have impacted them. That's a different project for a future day. In fact, probably an episode of this podcast in the future will be talking about, as a separate project, what I've been doing in public history, Anabaptist Amish Mennonite public history, as well as plans for developing my skills and creating an oral history collection. But what I will be working with are primary sources that have already been created and discussions and things that are already out there, drawn from all kinds of places. Um, because it's a theoretical and theological project engaging with literature, the dissertation, not so much an empirical project at the moment, though it is very much bolstered and supported by survivor storytelling. Um, and I guess, spoiler alert, I really think oral history is the way forward, because it allows the survivor to speak without the scholar being the so called expert interpreter. You know, if you do a qualitative interview, which might not be that different, especially if it's an open ended, unstructured interview with someone, the problem is what you're going to publish and put out there goes through your censorship. It goes through your interpretation. You're going to create the charts, you're going to do the coding and analysis, and then you publish your findings. But where does the survivor story go? It's only employed as far as it is instrumental to the research question you're asking and does not stand on its own, whereas in oral history it stands on its own as a piece of history, as evidence that people can and should pay attention to. So, for example, if you one of the things that one of the examples of oral history that we looked at in the oral history seminar that I just completed, were the WPA narratives of enslaved Americans, I think in the early 20th century, and how different that was from the prevailing scholarly understanding or approach or method, which honestly, you should have to justify those kinds of methods and approaches. Just because it's the norm doesn't mean you have to justify something different. I think you should have to justify that too, if that's what you're choosing to do. But the existing norm at that time was that enslaved people did not, like, enslaved people's accounts of their experiences had no place in the academy at large. This is speaking in generalities, but then you would take the enslavers' accounts as authoritative. Who had the authoritative voice? The enslavers, who probably had a lot more social capital, had a lot more wealth, and the ability sometimes to publish, to write, to speak, and be heard. So there were what Michel Rothschild would call like the silences in the academy, the thing that the academy did not care to research. And in fact, it was not the academy that went about doing the WPA interviews. It was, I believe, the United States federal government who did that and went and interviewed enslaved people, and their accounts are historical knowledge. They are now in, they were always historical knowledge, but they are now archived for the historical record. And then they are analyzed. Like, it's not just recording and archiving an experience, it's also what does that then, what are the implications of these testimonies, these stories, these life narratives in the way that we talk about the subject as a whole? Do we treat it and acknowledge it, and do we consider it knowledge? Do we allow that knowledge to challenge other conflicting forms of knowledge or accounts that, anyway, there's a whole lot of conversation to be had there, but that's just a little preview. So the format of this podcast is going to be, we're going to have, hopefully not too long, like I'll try to break things up into 20 or 30-minute episodes, because I think that's what is manageable. I will have research notes, and I will be soliciting interviews, comments, and feedback from people. So I want to hear from the people that I've interviewed before, the people that I'm in conversation with. Written comments are also welcome. I'll read them aloud and discuss them. So yeah, two kinds of episodes essentially. One will be the deep dive presentation style episodes with all the history, all the literature, essentially like a documentary, and then the response episodes. And perhaps, it's not like they're two separate genres either, because one might inform the other. What I'm hoping to do is create this as a public humanities project where, outside of my work, like by myself reading all this literature, what are the ways, particularly in which survivor and advocate input, as well as the input of those who have lived the life, who've walked the walk, walked in those shoes, uh, or who have, scholarly, relevant input in this. One interesting thing is my work is actually situated in the field of post-colonial political theology. And the reason why is because we are concerned with the question of empire. And I believe that Anabaptists and anarcho-pacifists, ever since we started talking about the Constantinian fall, we had been interested in the question of empire, but we perhaps not been very explicit about it. I think the question of empire has been considered largely in localized terms, in terms of, well, this is what's happening in what you call the center of the empire versus the periphery. So in the center, which is where it started, uh the periphery is all the places that you then go and the empire colonizes. But within the center, at least in terms of Christian empire, Constantinian empire, the main theological critiques have come from how these empires have affected Christianity and the church, within the places that they have ruled. So, for example, the Mennonite martyr Dirk Willems was perhaps, he can be seen as a victim of the Spanish Empire. When he was martyred, when he was killed, he was living in Aspren in the Netherlands, which was at that time ruled by the Spanish Empire. I believe this was in the mid 1600s. So that would have been after the Spanish Empire had started expanding in the so-called New World and committing all kinds of atrocities and enslavement and genocide. And at the same time, they were also enacting religious persecution and keeping a very tight lid on what Christians in their domain and also people who were not part of their church. They were keeping a very tight lid on what people believed, what people were allowed to, how people were allowed to practice their faith. But the question of empire, as I will talk about in the very deep dive into imperial masculinity and sexual violence in my theoretical framework, is an ideology of sexual violence, not just religious control, not just control of the churches, not just sort of bending the church to the empire's will. Um, and yet, I'm coming out of creating a coding framework analyzing in detail Peter Kelchicky's book called The Net of True Faith, which he wrote in 1440 to 1443 in the context of the Bohemian Reformation. Kelchicky was, and I apologize for pronouncing his name, he was someone who essentially articulated in full Christian anarchism for the very first time, sort of an anarcho-pacifist Christianity, where he was very explicit about the fact that he did not believe Christians should take any part of government, but he was also diagnosing what he thought was wrong about violence and empire. He talked about the lusts and the passions that drive the desire to oppress the peasants, to enslave people unrighteously, according to him. I think he says that Christ loves human beings essentially more than anything else in this world, and that when you commit violence against peasants, when you enslave and buy human beings, when you physically beat them and verbally abuse them, when you use the peasants' work and labor to fatten your bellies and to become rich and clothed in luxury, sitting on quote soft couches and becoming gorged and insipid. He had these very colorful descriptions of corruption, and it's a very monastic framework in which he links violence with a root cause, and that is lust, just the desire to not just become wealthy and lazy and gluttons, but also to expand your domains over both people, over religion, and just in terms of territory and in terms of property. His critiques are incredibly incisive, and yet Kelchicki did not emerge out of nowhere. He quotes John Wycliffe. He relies on things that the scholar who interpreted Enrico Monar believes to be rooted in Waldensian theology. And then I also provide a little bit more context, even before the Wycliffe and the Lollards and the Hussites and the Waldensians, and look at even how many different people, the Encratites, the Shinobites, can't pronounce it, the different monastic groups, the Franciscans, the Mendicants, the Beguines, the Tertiaries, they were all very concerned with the corruption and wealth of the church of their day. They were instituting movements within the church to become separate in some ways, to more faithfully restore sort of what they believe to be primitive Christianity. It's essentially like a primitivist restoration slash remnant movement that, like, even Kelchicki describes it as, you know, the imitation of Christ, the pursuit of Christ, living, laboring, simply in poverty, uh, embracing suffering, not in terms of self-inflicted suffering, but the suffering that is inflicted upon you when you go against the system, when you question, you know, when you are persecuted for your religious dissent. Anyway, that is just a little bit of a preview. I invite you along this journey to your comment. I've planned different interviews that are hopefully going to be very generative conversations. One thought that I would leave with you at the moment is also, how do we talk about and discuss the question of suffering and martyrdom? We don't even think of our theologies of martyrdom as suffering as being asceticism, as being monasticism, but we can often perpetuate a very torturous view of the body and of personhood and of the self, that sort of almost, when we embrace suffering, perhaps we also embrace and celebrate and spiritualize the violence. And when we do embrace and spiritualize the violence committed against us, we may also then end up in turn embrace spiritualizing and glorifying abuse and really destructive things. How did we create a spirituality like that? Right? A lot of this is based on the concept of the imitation of Christ dying on the cross. But if we really think about it, the history of this dying on the cross is the history of grotesque Roman torture that they did not just commit against Jesus, but that was meant to represent how Romans despised and trampled upon and desecrated the bodies of enslaved people. To be crucified was to be made a slave. The New Testament is very clear about that. Taking on the likeness. What does it mean to take on the likeness of a slave? It is incredibly visceral. It is incredibly violent. But then, many degrees removed and separated from it, we turn it into a beautiful metaphor. Like, I'm carrying my cross for, out to love the person, my neighbor, whatever. Or then it becomes, I'm carrying my cross to suffer at the hands of my abusive, uh, often it's in terms of an abusive spouse, that you're showing Christ's love for them, but you're really suffering in a very horrific way, because we have sort of dulled down, we have banalized the violence of crucifixion in terms of the Roman Imperium, in terms of what the Romans were trying to portray about themselves and about their so-called right to trample over and turn people's suffering and bodies into a spectacle. They gloried in that violent spectacle because it was a show of might. Now we have turned that into, from martyrdom, you get to the ascetic period. And in some ways, like, I'm looking at the positive side of asceticism, but I'm also looking at its harms. And one of those harms is we've turned a visceral, violent spectacle of might and abuse, sexual abuse, as David Toombs' research has shown. We've turned it into a spectacle of virtue, of our but that our spiritual strength is so strong that we can go through the torture of our bodies, even the willing and embraced and voluntary torture of the body, and the desecration of the body, the pathologization of its needs, and natural hunger, natural desires. We've turned that into inherently evil things. Lust, passions, desires, these are all things to be destroyed. The person then becomes the thing to be destroyed. And then when we idealize this form of spirituality, we make asceticism, which is kind of like a symbolic martyrdom, we make it into the perfect ultimate ideal of Christianity that's supposed to represent the ultimate ideal of Christ. Then we are left in a place where asceticism is does violence because it celebrates violence. So one of the things that I will be looking into is, like, how have we created essentially a horror genre that defines our faith? How have we celebrated, gloried in the spectacle of horrific suffering, and then seen that as being the essence of who we are, without any sort of vision of health and healing and community and mutual help and all that outside of that? We don't have anything other than the horror spectacle that we have created. And yeah, recently in a live stream podcast, this came up very briefly with Mary Byler and Rosanna Brubaker, and those are people that I hope to have in the podcast as well. And I recently, yeah. Oh, and also this podcast is going to have sort of updates of what I've been doing, the different projects I've been working on, just to show a little bit of what it's like to try to learn how to be a public humanities scholar and a public historian, while also working on conference papers, traveling to lots of different conferences, making the most of the graduate school experience while transitioning into and already having worked in public engagement, public scholarship all along. So yeah, one of the I think I'm going to be reading and responding to a recent book for which I wrote the introduction. It is by Mary Byler and Rosanna Brubaker. I think the title of the book is "We're Not Wrong, You Are," and Amish versus Mennonites. So Mary Byler was Old Order and Abe Troyer Amish. Rosanna Brubaker was, I think, Eastern Mennonite and different forms of Mennonite, very different groups. And the idea behind the book was to discuss similarities and differences, to show that it's not just one singularity. It's not just something you can brush over and say it's all the same. Plain people are not all the same. And that was the point of the book. They got someone who was a neutral party, who was neither Amish or Mennonite, to write the introduction. That person was me. And I read the book. I wrote about what we can appreciate from the sort of cross-cultural uh, experiences and conversations. And one of the themes that does come up in the book is like Dirk Willems, martyrdom, the martyr's mirror, etc. Super excited. I cannot wait to include more voices on this podcast. And yeah, so I will put a link to the book down in my description box below. And I will see you for future episodes of this research podcast.